The auction house in Caldwell, Montana reeked of tobacco and desperation. Eleanor Hastings stood on the wooden platform, her hands bound loosely with fraying rope, her eyes fixed on a water stain spreading across the ceiling. She'd learned early that looking at the faces below only made things worse. The leering grins, the calculating stares, the way some men licked their lips like she was livestock at the county fair. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She was 23 years old, and this was the third time she'd been sold. The auctioneer, a barrel-chested man named Virgil Pruitt, wiped sweat from his forehead despite the October chill seeping through the warehouse walls. Now, gentlemen, we've got ourselves a rare opportunity here. Miss Hastings comes with references, can cook, clean, mend, and I'm told she's got a steady hand with accounts. Starting bid is $200 to cover her father's outstanding debts to the Caldwell Mining Company. Eleanor's jaw tightened. Her father's debts. The phrase had followed her like a shadow since she was 16, when Thomas Hastings had gambled away their family farm in a poker game, then borrowed money he couldn't repay to start a failing freight business. When he'd died of pneumonia 2 winters ago, the debt hadn't died with him. It had simply transferred to his only living heir. The first time they'd sold her contract, she'd gone to a boarding house in Billings where the owner worked her 16-hour days and fed her table scraps. She'd lasted 8 months before the woman died, and her nephew sold Eleanor's contract to pay for the funeral. The second time, she'd ended up at a textile mill in Great Falls where the foreman's wandering hands had made every shift a nightmare. She'd run after 6 weeks, hiding in freight cars and stealing bread from bakery back doors, until they'd caught her in Caldwell and dragged her right back to this very platform. 200, called a voice from the back, a mine supervisor. She recognized from the saloon. 250. Another man, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Eleanor's stomach churned. The rope around her wrists had rubbed the skin raw, and her dress, the same faded blue cotton she'd been wearing when they'd caught her, hung loose on her frame. She'd lost weight running, living on scraps and fear. 300. The mine supervisor again, more aggressive now. Virgil's eyes gleamed. The higher the bid, the bigger his commission. $300. Do I hear 350? Remember, gentlemen, this isn't just any contract. Miss Hastings here has education. Her mother was a schoolteacher before she passed. The girl can read, write, do figures. That's worth something. Eleanor wanted to scream that she wasn't a girl, wasn't property, wasn't something to be traded like a mule or a pocket watch. But screaming had never helped before. The law was clear. Debts passed to kin, and if you couldn't pay, you worked them off. The system was legal, stamped and approved by men in wood-paneled offices who'd never stood on an auction platform in their lives. 350, came a new voice, low and measured. The crowd shifted, and Eleanor couldn't help herself. She looked. He stood near the side entrance, a tall man in his mid-30s with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. He wore working clothes, denim pants, a canvas jacket, scuffed boots, but there was something different about him. Maybe it was the way he held himself, straight-backed but not rigid, or the way his gray eyes swept the room with quiet assessment rather than aggression. Virgil perked up at the fresh bidder. 350 from Mr. Brennan. Thomas Brennan of the Pazingua Rolling Bee Ranch, for those who don't know. Fine establishment north of here. Do I hear 400? 400. The mine supervisor wasn't backing down. The man Brennan didn't flinch. 450. A murmur rippled through the crowd. That was more than double the opening bid. The mine supervisor scowled, clearly calculating whether his pride was worth the expense. After a long moment, he spat tobacco juice onto the floor and shook his head. $450. Virgil's voice cracked with excitement. Going once, going twice. He slammed his gavel down. Sold to Thomas Brennan. Eleanor's knees nearly buckled. Another owner. Another place where she'd be worked until she dropped, or until whoever held her contract decided to sell her again. The cycle never ended. It just changed locations. Brennan moved through the crowd with steady purpose, pulling a leather wallet from his jacket. He counted out the money in crisp bills, handing them to Virgil without ceremony. The auctioneer grinned, his teeth stained yellow. "Pleasure doing business, Mr. Brennan. She's all yours. The contract transfers full ownership of her labor for the next 5 years, or until the debt is satisfied, whichever comes first." "I understand the terms," Brennan said quietly. Virgil gestured for Eleanor to step down from the platform. She moved carefully, her legs stiff from standing, her wrists still bound. When she reached the floor, Brennan turned to look at her for the first time up close. His eyes weren't cruel, but they weren't warm either, just gray and unreadable as winter clouds. "Can you walk?" he asked. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. "Good, my wagon's outside. Let's go." He didn't grab her arm or shove her forward like the mine supervisor would have. He simply turned and walked toward the door, clearly expecting her to follow. Eleanor did, because what choice did she have? The rope around her wrists felt heavier with each step. Outside, the October air bit at her cheeks. Main Street was mostly empty at this hour, just a few cowboys loading supplies at the general store, and a dog nosing through trash behind the hotel. Brennan's wagon waited at the hitching post, a sturdy buckboard with 2 bay horses in the traces. He moved to the back, pulling out a folding knife. Eleanor instinctively stepped back. "Easy," he said, his voice still that same measured tone. "Just cutting the rope." She held her breath as he grasped the binding and sawed through it with 2 quick strokes. The rope fell away, and Eleanor rubbed her raw wrists, feeling the sting of returning circulation. "Thank you," she whispered, the words automatic. Brennan folded the knife and tucked it back in his pocket. "Get in. It's a 3-hour ride to the ranch." Eleanor climbed onto the wagon bench, her body aching from exhaustion and tension. Brennan swung up beside her, taking the reins with practiced ease. He clicked his tongue, and the horses started forward. Their hooves clopping against the packed dirt street. They rode in silence through Caldwell, past the bank and the saloon, and the church with its white steeple pointing at the pale sky. Eleanor watched the town disappear behind them, replaced by rolling grassland and distant mountains. The land here was beautiful in a harsh way, all big sky and bigger emptiness. After an hour, Brennan finally spoke. "You hungry?" Eleanor's stomach had been empty for so long she'd almost stopped noticing. "Yes, sir." He reached behind the seat and pulled out a cloth bundle, unwrapping it to reveal thick slices of bread and dried beef. He handed her a portion without looking at her, his attention on the road ahead. Eleanor ate slowly, trying not to seem desperate even though her hands trembled with hunger. The food was simple but good, better than anything she'd had in weeks. "There's rules at the ranch," Brennan said after she'd finished eating. "You'll have your own room in the main house. You'll help with cooking, cleaning, mending, the usual work. My foreman, Jack Sutherland, and 2 ranch hands live in the bunkhouse. They know to keep their distance. Anyone bothers you, you tell." "Me?" Eleanor stared at him, unsure what to make of this. Rules that included her own room? Men who were supposed to keep their distance? It sounded too good to be true. "Why did you buy my contract?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Brennan was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally he said, "Ranch needs help. My wife died 2 years ago. Been managing on my own." But it's too much. His wife, so he was a widower. That explained something, though Eleanor wasn't sure what. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, because it seemed like the right thing to say. He nodded once, curt. "Her name was Catherine. We don't talk about her much." The message was clear. Don't ask questions. Eleanor could respect that. She had her own topic she didn't want to discuss. They rode on as the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning chill. The landscape opened up. revealing the Rolling Bee Ranch in the distance, a sprawling property with a two-story house, several outbuildings, and cattle dotting the hills beyond. It looked solid, established, the kind of place built to last generations. As they approached, Eleanor felt the familiar weight settling back into her chest, the knowledge that she was owned, that her life was not her own, that this man beside her held the contract that bound her to 5 years of servitude. It didn't matter that he'd cut her ropes or given her food. She was still property. Brennan pulled the wagon up to the house and set the brake. He climbed down, then paused, looking up at her with those unreadable gray eyes. "One more thing," he sighed. "You try to run, I'll find you. Not because I'm cruel, but because that's how the law works. But if you stay honest, I'll treat you fair. That's my word." Eleanor met his gaze, searching for the lie, the hidden threat. But all she saw was a tired man who seemed to mean exactly what he said. "Yes, sir," she replied. He nodded and gestured toward the house. "Come on. I'll show you where you'll be staying." Eleanor climbed down from the wagon, her new life beginning with each step toward the door. Another chapter in a story she'd never chosen to write. The inside of the house surprised Eleanor. She'd expected something sparse and bachelor-worn, but instead found polished wood floors, lace curtains at the windows, and furniture that spoke of careful maintenance. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, its mantel lined with small carved figures, horses, cattle, a lone wolf. Photographs in simple frames showed a younger Brennan standing beside a dark-haired woman with kind eyes. Catherine, Eleanor thought. The wife who was not to be discussed. Brennan moved through the space with the ease of someone who knew every creaking floorboard. "Kitchen's through there," he said, pointing to a doorway on the left. "Pantry's stocked. Jack brings supplies from town every 2 weeks. Your room's upstairs, second door on the right." He started toward the staircase, and Eleanor followed, her boots quiet on the steps. The second-floor hallway was narrow but clean, with 3 closed doors. Brennan opened the one he'd indicated and stepped aside. The room was small but complete. A single bed with a patchwork quilt, a dresser with a cracked mirror, a window overlooking the front yard, and a wooden chair in the corner. Compared to the mill dormitory where she'd slept on a straw mattress with 12 other women, it felt like luxury. "There's linens in the dresser," Brennan said. "Washrooms at the end of the hall. We pump water from the well, but there's a basin and pitcher in there for morning washing." He paused in the doorway. "Breakfast is at dawn. I'll expect you in the kitchen by then." "Yes, sir." He studied her for a moment, his expression difficult to read. "My name is Thomas. You can use it if you want, sir." Every other word gets tiresome. Before Eleanor could respond, he was gone, his boots heavy on the stairs. She stood alone in her new room, listening to the house settle around her. Through the window, she could see the barn, the corral with horses moving lazily in the afternoon sun, and beyond that, the vast Montana sky stretching forever. She sat on the bed, testing its firmness. The quilt was hand-stitched, likely by Catherine. Everything in this house seemed to carry her ghost, the careful touches, the warmth that persisted despite 2 years of absence. Eleanor wondered what kind of woman she'd been, this rancher's wife who'd left such an impression on a place. A knock on the doorframe made her jump. A man stood there, older than Brennan by at least a decade, with silver threading through his brown hair and deep-set wrinkles around his eyes. He wore working clothes and held his hat in his weathered hands. "Name's Jack Sutherland," he said, his voice gravelly but not unkind. "I'm the foreman here. Thomas asked me to show you around the property once you settled in." Eleanor stood. "I'm Eleanor Hastings. I know who you are." Jack's face was neutral, but there was something in his eyes, pity, maybe, or understanding. "Come on down when you're ready. I'll be by the barn." He left without waiting for an answer. Eleanor took a moment to splash water from the basin on her face, washing away the dust from the road. Her reflection in the cracked mirror showed a woman who looked older than 23, her brown hair tangled, her dress worn thin at the seams. She'd left her life at 16, and somewhere along the way, she'd stopped recognizing herself. Outside, the air held the scent of hay and livestock. Jack waited by the barn door, whittling a piece of wood with a small knife. He looked up as she approached and pocketed both the knife and wood. "You ever work a ranch before?" he asked. "No, sir. Just boarding houses and the mill." Jack nodded slowly. "Well, it's different here. We run about 300 head of cattle, plus the horses. Thomas does most of the range work with me and the hands Pete Morrison and Danny Kowalski. You won't need to worry about that part. Your work's in the house, but it helps to know the layout." He led her on the property, pointing out the bunkhouse where he and the other men slept, the chicken coop that would need tending, the root cellar for winter storage, and the smokehouse where they preserved meat. The ranch was larger than Eleanor had realized, a self-sustaining operation that required constant work. "Thomas is fair," Jack said as they walked past the corral. "He don't raise his voice, don't drink to excess, pays his debts on time. After Catherine died, double quotes, he trailed off, glancing at Eleanor. Well, he's been quieter, works harder. Sometimes I think he forgets to eat if someone don't remind him." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "How did she die?" Eleanor asked, then immediately regretted it. "I'm sorry, that's not my business." Jack was quiet for several steps. "Fever, suddenly one spring. We rode to Caldwell for the doctor, but by the time we got back, she was gone. Thomas hasn't been the same since. Not worse exactly, just different, like part of him went missing." They reached the vegetable garden behind the house, now mostly empty after the autumn harvest. A few hardy plants still clung to life: squash vines, late carrots, herbs going to seed. "Catherine planted this," Jack said. "Thomas keeps it going best he can, but it needs a woman's touch. Might be something you could take on, if you're willing." Eleanor looked at the neglected beds and felt a strange stirring of possibility. "I'd like that." Jack smiled, the first real warmth she'd seen from him. "Good. Now about the housework. Thomas is particular about some things, easy about others. He likes his coffee strong, breakfast simple. Dinner's the main meal. He don't care much for fancy cooking, but he appreciates food that sticks to your ribs. Catherine used to make bread twice a week. The sourdough starter's still in the pantry, if you know how to use it." They walked back toward the house as the sun began its descent. Jack paused at the porch steps. "One more thing, Eleanor. The hands Pete and Danny, they're good men, but they're still men. They know Thomas's rules, and they know the consequences of breaking them. But if either of them makes you uncomfortable, you come tell me or Thomas right away." "Understood?" "Yes, sir. Jack," he corrected. "We don't stand on ceremony much here." Eleanor nodded, grateful for the kindness in his voice. As Jack headed toward the bunkhouse, she entered the house through the back door, finding herself in the kitchen. It was spacious, with a large cast-iron stove, a pump sink, shelves lined with dishes and supplies, and a heavy wooden table that could seat 6. She began exploring the pantry, taking inventory of what was available. Flour, cornmeal, salt pork, dried beans, preserved vegetables in mason jars, the sourdough starter Jack had mentioned. Her mind started working through meal possibilities, planning what she could prepare for tomorrow's breakfast and beyond. The sun was setting when she heard boots on the front porch. Brennan Thomas came in, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. He looked tired, dust covering his clothes and face. "There's a stew pot on the stove," he said without preamble. "It's from yesterday, just needs heating. I usually eat simple food at night." Eleanor moved to the stove, checking the pot. The stew was thick with beef and vegetables. well made even if it had lost some freshness. She stoked the fire and set the pot to warm, then found bowls and spoons. They ate at the kitchen table in silence. Thomas focused on his food with single-minded purpose. Eleanor ate more slowly, still adjusting to the reality of regular meals. When they finished, Thomas carried his bowl to the sink. "You'll find what you need for cleaning in the cupboard under there," he said. "I usually wash my own dishes, but I suppose that's your job now." There was no malice in his words, just statement of fact. Eleanor stood and moved to the sink, grateful for something useful to do. As she pumped water and scrubbed the bowls, Thomas lingered by the doorway. "Jack showed you around?" he asked. "Yes." "Good. If you need anything, supplies, tools, whatever, make a list. We'll get it next town run." He shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the conversation. "The house is yours to manage how you see fit. Catherine had her ways of doing things. You'll have yours. I don't expect you to be her." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning Eleanor couldn't quite parse. Before she could respond, Thomas was gone, his boots heavy on the stairs. Eleanor finished the dishes, dried them, and put them away. She banked the stove for the night and stood in the darkening kitchen, listening to the house creak and settle. Somewhere above, a door closed softly. This place was different from the boarding house and the mill, that much was clear. But different didn't mean safe, and it certainly didn't mean free. She was still bound by contract, still owned in all the ways that mattered. The rope around her wrists might be gone, but the invisible chains remained. Tomorrow she would wake. Before dawn, make breakfast for a man who owned her labor, and begin working off a debt she'd never asked for. But tonight, for the first time in years, she would sleep in a real bed with clean sheets and a door she could close. It wasn't freedom, but it was something. Eleanor climbed the stairs to her small room, undressed in the darkness, and slid between the covers Catherine Brennan had sewn. Through the window, stars blazed across the Montana sky, distant, cold, and impossibly bright. Eleanor woke to darkness and the distant crow of a rooster. For a disoriented moment, she forgot where she was, then memory returned with the weight of her circumstances. The Rolling Bee Ranch, Thomas Brennan. 5 years of servitude stretching ahead like an endless road. She dressed quickly in the cold air, splashing water on her face from the basin. Her dress was the same faded blue she'd worn for weeks, and she made a mental note to ask about fabric for sewing. If she was going to work here, she needed clothes that wouldn't fall apart. The kitchen was empty when she arrived, but coals still glowed in the stove. Eleanor fed them kindling and logs until flames caught, then filled the coffee pot with grounds and water. While it brewed, she found eggs in the cold box, bacon in the pantry, and flour for biscuits. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency. Cooking was one skill the boarding house had taught her well. Thomas appeared just as the biscuits came out of the oven, their tops golden brown. He looked surprised to find breakfast already prepared, but said nothing, just poured himself coffee and sat at the table. Jack arrived moments later, followed by 2 younger men Eleanor hadn't met. "Pete Morrison," said the first, a lanky man in his 20s with sun-bleached hair and an easy smile. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Hastings." "Danny Kowalski," added the second, shorter and stockier, with dark eyes and cautious politeness. "Ma'am," Eleanor nodded to both, setting plates on the table. The men ate with the focused intensity of people who burned calories faster than they could replace them. Thomas remained quiet, but Pete filled the silence with chatter about fence repairs needed in the south pasture and a cow that had gone lame. "I'll ride out after breakfast," Thomas said, his first words of the morning. "Jack, you take Danny and check the water troughs. Pete, there's firewood needs splitting." The division of labor was clear and efficient. Within 20 minutes, the men had finished eating and dispersed to their tasks. Eleanor cleared the table, washed dishes, and began taking stock of what needed attention in the house. Catherine's presence was everywhere. The carefully organized pantry, the herbs hanging to dry above the window, the embroidered pillowcases on the sofa. But 2 years of bachelor living had taken its toll. Dust gathered in corners. Curtains needed washing. The floors wanted a proper scrubbing. Eleanor spent the morning cleaning, working methodically through each room. She found supplies under the sink, rags that had once been dish towels, a broom with half its bristles worn away. The physical labor felt good after weeks of running and hiding. At least here she knew what was expected. Around midday, she made sandwiches from leftover bacon and carried them out to Pete, who was indeed splitting firewood behind the barn. He paused when he saw her, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the October chill. "Well, that's mighty kind of you, Miss Hastings," he said, accepting the plate. "Usually we just fend for ourselves at lunch." "It's no trouble," Eleanor replied. "I made extra." Pete bit into the sandwich with obvious appreciation. "You're a far sight better cook than Thomas, no offense to the boss. He means well, but his idea of a meal is whatever doesn't require more than one pot." He grinned. Catherine used to say he'd eat boot leather if she fried it up crispy enough. The easy mention of Catherine caught Eleanor off guard. At the boarding house and mill, the dead were spoken of in whispers if at all. But Pete talked about her like she was simply away, not gone forever. "You knew her?" Eleanor asked. "Yes, ma'am. Been working here 5 years now. Catherine was good people, always had a kind word, never treated us hands like we were beneath her." His expression sobered. "Her dying hit us all hard, but Thomas worst of all. He and Catherine, they were." He searched for words. "They fit, you know. Like two halves of the same coin." Eleanor understood that kind of loss, even if she'd never experienced it herself. Her own mother had died when she was young, and her father had never recovered, filling the void with cards and whiskey and bad decisions. "Anyway," Pete continued, "it's good having someone in the house again. Place has been too quiet." Lena returned to her work, Pete's words lingering in her mind. The house had been quiet, she could feel it in the stillness. The way sound seemed muffled, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She wondered if her presence would change that, or if she was just another temporary occupant. In a place that belonged to ghosts. By evening, she'd made progress. The main floor gleamed, curtains hung fresh from washing, and a beef roast cooked slowly in the oven, filling the house with rich aroma. When Thomas came in at dusk, he stopped in the doorway, looking around as if seeing the space for the first time. "You've been busy," he said quietly. "It needed doing." He nodded, removing his hat and coat. His hands were scraped and dirty, his face windburned. Ranch work was hard. Eleanor realized, not the kind of labor where you could coast or cut corners. Every day demanded everything you had. Dinner was quieter with just the two of them. Jack and the hands ate in the bunkhouse, leaving Thomas and Eleanor alone at the kitchen table. She'd set out the roast with potatoes and carrots, simple food. Done well. Thomas ate steadily, occasionally glancing at her across the table. "This is good," he said finally. "Better than I've managed, thank you." More silence. Eleanor searched for something to say, some way to fill the awkward space between them. In the end, Thomas spoke first. "I went to town for supplies tomorrow," he said. "You'll come with me. You need clothes, other things. Make a list tonight." Eleanor blinked, surprised. "That's not necessary. I can make do. You can't work in one dress." His tone was matter-of-fact, not unkind. "We'll leave after breakfast. The ride's about 2 hours." It wasn't a request, Eleanor realized. It was an order, even if delivered gently. She was his employee, bought and paid for. He got to decide when she went to town, what she wore, how she spent her time. The reminder settled like a stone in her stomach. After dinner, Thomas retreated to a small room off the main floor that served as his office. Eleanor could hear him shuffling papers, the scratch of a pen. She washed dishes, wiped down surfaces, and finally sat at the table with a scrap of paper to make her list. Fabric for dresses, thread, needles, undergarments, a warmer, shawl for winter. She kept the list practical, nothing frivolous. Money spent. On her was money she owed, another link in the chain keeping her bound. Upstairs, she prepared for bed by candlelight. Through the window, she could see lights in the bunkhouse where the hands were settling in. Laughter drifted across the yard. Pete's voice, then Danny's quieter response. They sounded easy, comfortable. Men who'd chosen this life rather than having it forced upon them. Eleanor blew out the candle and lay in the darkness, listening to the house creak. Somewhere down the hall, Thomas moved around his room. Footsteps, the sound of boots dropping to the floor, the squeak of bed springs. Then silence. Her first full day at the Rolling Bee Ranch had passed. She'd cooked, cleaned, and proven herself useful. It should have felt like progress, but instead, Eleanor felt the weight of time stretching ahead, one day down. Hundreds more to go before her debt was satisfied and she could claim her life as her own, if that day ever came. She turned on her side, pulling the quilt up to her chin. Catherine's quilt, made by hands that would never sew again. The thought should have been morbid, but instead Eleanor found it oddly comforting. Someone had lived in this house, had loved and been loved, had made something beautiful that outlasted her. Maybe that was enough to leave behind proof you'd existed, even if the world moved on without you. Sleep came slowly, filled with half-formed dreams of auction houses and endless roads. When Eleanor finally sank into deeper rest, her last conscious thought was of Thomas Brennan's gray eyes watching her across the dinner table, unreadable as stone. Tomorrow they would go to town. Tomorrow she would be seen walking beside the man who owned her contract, and the whole of Caldwell would know exactly what she was: property dressed up in borrowed dignity, a debt collector's daughter paying for sins that weren't her own. But tonight, in this small room with its clean sheets and locked door, Eleanor allowed herself to pretend otherwise. Just for a few hours. Just until dawn. The morning air bit sharp as Eleanor climbed onto the wagon beside Thomas. Frost touched the grass in silver patterns, and their breath came out in visible puffs. Thomas had hitched the same two bay horses, checking their harnesses. With methodical care before helping Eleanor up, a gesture that surprised her with its casual courtesy. They rolled out as the sun broke over the eastern hills, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Thomas drove in his usual silence, but it felt less oppressive than before. Eleanor found herself watching the landscape pass, the way morning light caught on fence posts, how cattle lifted their heads to watch the wagon go by, the distant mountains standing like sentinels against the horizon. "You settling in all right?" Thomas asked after the first hour. The question was unexpected. Eleanor glanced at him, but his eyes stayed on the road. "Yes, everyone's been kind. Jack says you've taken to the garden. It needs work, but the soil's good. With proper care, it could produce well next season." Thomas nodded, seeming to consider this. Catherine always said a garden was worth the effort. "I've let it go too long." He paused. "There's seed catalogs in the office. When winter comes, you can order what you need for spring planting." Eleanor felt a strange flutter in her chest, not quite hope, but something adjacent to it. Planning for spring meant he expected her to still be here months from now, that she wasn't just temporary help to be sold off when convenient. Then reality reasserted itself. Of course she'd still be here. She was contracted for 5 years. Caldwell appeared gradually, first as smoke from chimneys, then as buildings taking shape against the prairie. The town had grown since Eleanor's last forced visit to the auction house. New storefronts lined Main Street, and a hotel under construction promised expansion. Progress, people called it. Eleanor saw only more places where desperate people could be traded like commodities. Thomas guided the wagon to the Mercantile, a 2-story building with painted letters advertising dry goods and supplies. He set the brake and helped Eleanor down, his hand briefly steadying her elbow. The touch was impersonal, but not cold, the same way he'd handle anything fragile that might break. Inside, the Mercantile smelled of coffee, tobacco, and new fabric. Shelves rose floor to ceiling, crammed with everything from canned peaches to saddle soap. A woman stood behind the counter, middle-aged with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun. Her sharp eyes fixed on Eleanor immediately, taking in the worn dress and work-roughened hands. "Thomas Brennan," the woman said, her tone cooling several degrees. "Haven't seen you in town for a spell, Mrs. Palmer." Thomas removed his hat. "Need to outfit Miss Hastings here. She's working at the ranch now." Mrs. Palmer's gaze could have stripped paint. "Is that so? And how'd you come by this on employee?" The pause before employee carried volumes of judgment. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, shame mixing with anger. She knew what the woman saw: another piece of human collateral, bought at auction because her father couldn't pay his debts. "That's my business," Thomas said quietly, but there was steel underneath. "We need fabric for dresses, thread, needles, and whatever else Miss Hastings requires. I'd appreciate your assistance." Mrs. Palmer sniffed but moved toward the fabric section, clearly unwilling to turn away paying customers despite her moral objections. She pulled down bolts of cloth, practical cotton in subdued colors, nothing fancy or expensive. "This would be suitable for work dresses," she said, addressing Thomas rather than Eleanor. "Sturdy weave, won't show stains." "I can speak for myself," Eleanor said, surprising everyone including herself. "May I see the blue one, and that brown as well?" Mrs. Palmer's eyebrows rose, but she handed over the bolts. Eleanor examined them with critical eyes, checking the weave quality and imagining how they'd wear. Her mother had taught her to sew before she died, and those skills had served Eleanor well over the years. The blue, Eleanor decided, and the brown. 5 yards of each should suffice. "I'll also need white thread, needles in assorted sizes, and buttons, nothing decorative. Just functional." Thomas watched this exchange with an expression Eleanor couldn't read. Mrs. Palmer measured and cut the fabric with sharp, precise movements, her disapproval radiating like heat from a stove. "Will there be anything else?" she asked. "Wundergarments," Eleanor said firmly, refusing to be embarrassed. "And a winter shawl if you have one that's reasonably priced." Mrs. Palmer directed her to a display at the back. Eleanor selected what she needed while Thomas waited by the counter, examining a new bridle with apparent fascination. When Eleanor returned with her choices, Mrs. Palmer tallied everything with grim efficiency. "That'll be $12.35. Thomas paid without hesitation, counting out bills and coins. Mrs. Palmer wrapped the purchases in brown paper, tying them with twine. As Thomas gathered the packages, she leaned across the counter. "There's talk in town," she said quietly, "about you buying that girl's contract. People remember what happened to Catherine. They're wondering if you're looking for a replacement." Thomas's jaw tightened. People can wonder all they want. Doesn't make it their business or their truth. He turned and walked out, leaving Eleanor to follow. She caught up with him at the wagon, where he was loading packages with controlled, angry movements. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said. "I didn't mean to cause problems. You didn't cause anything." Thomas secured the last package. "People in this town have too much time and too little sense. They see what they want to see. What do they see?" He looked at her then, really looked, and Eleanor saw something raw in his expression: grief, maybe, or frustration, or both. "They see a widower who can't move past his wife's death. They see you and assume I'm trying to fill a hole that can't be filled." He climbed onto the wagon. "What they don't see is that I needed help. You needed a place that wasn't the auction block, and sometimes practical arrangements are just that. Practical." Eleanor climbed up beside him, absorbing this. It was the most Thomas had said at one time, and the honesty startled her. He wasn't pretending their situation was anything other than what it was, a transaction born of necessity, not sentiment. They stopped at the general store for supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, salt. The proprietor, an elderly man named Mr. Chun, treated them with polite efficiency, and no judgment. Thomas also purchased fabric for new work shirts and a winter coat for Eleanor that she hadn't asked for but desperately needed. "Can't have you freezing," he said when she protested. Montana winters aren't forgiving. Their last stop was the feed store, where Thomas arranged for grain delivery. While he conducted business, Eleanor waited by the wagon, watching Caldwell's residents go about their day. She recognized a few faces from her time here before. The banker who'd filed the debt claim against her, the lawyer who'd explained she had no legal recourse, the sheriff who'd caught her when she ran. None of them acknowledged her. She was invisible now, just another servant, another woman whose life had been decided by men with ledgers and gavels. The ride back felt longer, though the sun hadn't yet reached its peak. Thomas seemed lost in thought, his expression distant. Eleanor wondered what he was thinking, about Catherine, probably, about the gossip Mrs. Palmer had mentioned, about whether bringing Eleanor to the ranch had been a mistake. "Can I ask you something?" Eleanor said, breaking the silence. Thomas glanced at her. "Go ahead. Why didn't you just hire someone? Regular wages, no contract. It would have been simpler." He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, "Hired help leaves. Especially women. They get married, move on, find better situations. I needed someone who'd stay, at least long enough to make the ranch run proper again." He shifted the reins, and maybe I thought I was doing something decent. Buying your contract, I mean. You were going to get sold regardless. At least this way, you'd have a roof, regular meals, work that won't break you. "That's very practical of you," Eleanor said, and couldn't quite keep the bitterness from her voice. "Practical is all I've got left," Thomas replied. "Everything else died 2 years ago." The words hung between them, bleak and honest. Eleanor understood then that Thomas Brennan wasn't cruel or kind. He was simply surviving, doing what needed doing to get from one day to the next. In that way, they weren't so different. Both trapped by circumstances beyond their control, both trying to find solid ground in lives that had shifted beneath their feet. The ranch appeared in the distance, familiar now after only 2 days. Eleanor felt an odd relief at seeing it, not home, exactly, but something close enough to pass. A place where she knew the routines, where expectations were clear, where she could work and sleep and exist without constant fear of what came next. Thomas pulled the wagon up to the house and began unloading packages. Eleanor helped, carrying her new fabric and supplies upstairs to her room. Through the window, she saw Jack working with one of the horses in the corral, Pete chopping wood, Danny mending a section of fence. Life at the Rolling Bee Ranch continued its steady rhythm, indifferent to town gossip or Eleanor's complicated feelings. There was work to be done, always work, and that at least was something she understood. That evening, as she cut patterns from her new fabric by lamplight, Eleanor thought about Mrs. Palmer's words. People wondering if Thomas was looking for a replacement for Catherine. The idea seemed absurd. You couldn't replace a person any more than you could replace a limb or a heartbeat. Catherine was gone, and that absence marked everything in this house, from the photographs on the mantel to the garden, slowly returning to wilderness. Eleanor wasn't a replacement. She was just someone passing through, working off a debt sheet. Never asked for, existing in the spaces Catherine had left behind. 5 years, and then she'd be free to go wherever she wanted. If she could remember what freedom felt like by then. November arrived with the first real snowfall, transforming the ranch into something from a watercolor painting. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window watching fat flakes drift down, coating everything in white silence. She'd been at the Rolling Bee for 3 weeks now, and the rhythm of ranch life had become familiar. Wake before dawn, prepare meals, manage the house, tend the small tasks that kept everything running. Her new dresses hung in the wardrobe, practical and well-made. She'd sewn them by lamplight over several evenings, her fingers remembering skills her mother had taught her years ago. Thomas had noticed, nodding approval at the neat stitching, though he'd said nothing beyond good work. The kitchen had become Eleanor's domain. She'd reorganized the pantry, inventoried supplies, and begun experimenting with Catherine's old recipes notes scribbled on scraps of paper tucked between jars. Some were simple: cornbread, stew, roasted chicken. Others more ambitious: fruit preserves, pickled vegetables, a cake recipe with precise measurements for special occasions. Eleanor tried the cake once, presenting it at dinner with nervous pride. Thomas had stared at it for a long moment before. Taking a slice, he'd eaten it slowly, his expression unreadable, then quietly said, "Catherine made this for my birthday every year." The words had landed like stones. Eleanor had apologized, but Thomas shook his head. "Don't. It's good to have it again. Just unexpected." Now, watching snow accumulate on fence posts and barn roofs, Eleanor wondered how many other memories lay buried in this house, waiting to surface at unexpected moments. Living among Catherine's things meant constantly brushing against her ghost: the embroidered pillows, the herb garden, the way certain drawers were organized with particular precision. "Storm's coming in heavy," Jack said, stamping snow from his boots as he entered through the back door. "Thomas wants to bring the cattle down from the high pasture before it gets worse. We'll be out most of the day." Eleanor turned from the window. "I'll have hot food ready when you return." Jack smiled, his weathered face creasing with warmth. "You're spoiling us, Eleanor. We got used to cold beans and stale bread." "Then it's time you got unused to it," she replied, already planning a hearty stew that could simmer for hours. The men rode out after breakfast, bundled in heavy coats and scarves. Eleanor watched them disappear into swirling white, then returned to her work. The house needed preparation for deep winter windows checked for drafts, extra firewood brought inside, blankets aired and ready. She was in the main room, beating dust from a heavy quilt when she noticed the small chest tucked beneath the side table. It was wooden, intricately carved with flowers and vines, and clearly handmade. Eleanor hesitated, knowing she shouldn't pry, but curiosity won out. She knelt and opened the lid. Inside were letters, dozens of them, tied with faded ribbon. The top envelope was addressed to Thomas in elegant script. Eleanor's hand hovered over them, torn between respect for privacy and the sudden, desperate need to understand the man who owned her contract. She pulled out one letter, just one, and unfolded it carefully. "My dearest Thomas, I write this knowing you may never read it, but the doctor says I should put my affairs in order, and words on paper feel more permanent than whispered conversations. If you're reading this, it means I've gone ahead, and I'm sorry for that. Sorry to leave you. Sorry to miss all the years we should have had. Don't mourn too long, my love. You have too much life left to spend it all looking backward. The ranch needs you, and someday, you'll need someone to share it with again. When that time comes, and it will come, even if you can't imagine it now, don't feel guilty. I want you to be happy. I want you to find joy again, whatever form it takes. Remember that love isn't finite. Opening your heart to someone new doesn't diminish what we had. It just means you're strong enough to keep living, keep building, keep hoping. All my love, always." Catherine. Eleanor's hands trembled as she refolded the letter. She felt like an intruder, witnessing something intensely private. Yet Catherine's words echoed in her mind. Don't mourn too long, find joy again, love isn't finite. Had Thomas read these? Did he believe them? She returned the letter carefully, closed the chest, and pushed it back under the table. The quilt forgotten, Eleanor moved through the rest of her day in a strange fog, Catherine's words circling through her thoughts. The men returned at dusk, covered in snow and exhausted. Eleanor had stew ready, thick with beef and vegetables, and fresh bread still warm from the oven. They ate with grateful intensity, too tired for much conversation. Thomas looked particularly worn, his face wind-burned and his movements stiff with cold. "Bad out there?" Eleanor asked, refilling his coffee. "Could be worse. Got the herd moved in time." He wrapped his hands around the mug, seeking its warmth. "Temperatures dropping fast. We'll need to check the livestock through the night. Make sure none freeze. I can help, Eleanor offered. I don't know much about cattle, but I can learn. Thomas looked at her with surprise. That's not housework. Neither is freezing while you exhaust yourself. If you show me what to do, I'm willing. Something shifted. In Thomas's expression, respect, maybe, or at least recognition, that she was offering more than her contract required. All right, we'll do rounds at midnight. Dress warm. That night, Eleanor layered herself in every warm garment she owned, including the coat Thomas had bought in Caldwell. She met him at the barn, where he handed her a lantern and led her through the snow to the nearest shelter where some of the cattle huddled. Just checking they're all moving, none lying down unable to get up, Thomas explained, his breath forming clouds. Cold like this can kill if they're weak or sick. They moved from shelter to shelter, Thomas pointing out signs of distress, showing her how to recognize trouble. Eleanor listened intently, memorizing everything. The work was cold and tiring, but there was something satisfying about it, tangible problems with clear solutions, unlike the complicated emotional terrain she'd been navigating. You're a quick study, Thomas said as they finished the last check. Most people from town would have complained the whole way. I'm not most people from town, Eleanor replied. And I've done worse work in worse conditions. Thomas studied her in the lantern light. The mill, among other places. At least here the work matters. At the mill, I was just another pair of hands making someone else rich. They walked back toward the house, boots crunching in fresh snow. The storm had passed, leaving the sky clear and star-filled. Montana night stretched overhead, vast and indifferent. Eleanor, Thomas said as they reached the porch. He seemed to struggle with words, unusual for him. What I said in town about this being practical, I meant it. But that doesn't mean I don't appreciate what you've done here. The house, the cooking, tonight. You work harder than you need to. I work hard because that's who I am, Eleanor said. Not because of any contract. Thomas nodded slowly. Fair enough. Inside, Eleanor heated leftover coffee while Thomas added logs to the fire. They sat in the main room for a few minutes, warming themselves before bed. The silence between them had changed over the weeks, less awkward now, more companionable. Catherine wrote you letters, Eleanor said suddenly, then caught herself. I'm sorry. I found a chest under the table while cleaning. I only read one, and I shouldn't have. She expected anger, but Thomas just looked tired. I know the chest. Haven't opened it since the funeral. He stared into the fire. What did she say? Eleanor hesitated, then decided honesty was simpler than evasion. She wanted you to be happy, to not mourn too long, to know that loving someone new wouldn't diminish what you had together. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Catherine always was wiser than me. Even dying, she was thinking about after. He stood, the conversation clearly over. Get some sleep. Morning comes early. Eleanor climbed the stairs to her room, exhausted but oddly settled. Something had shifted tonight in the work they'd done together, in the conversation they'd shared, in the way Thomas had looked at her like she was a person rather than property. She knew better than to read too much into it. Thomas was grieving, she was contracted, and whatever passed between them existed within strict boundaries. But Catherine's words lingered. Love isn't finite, don't mourn too long. Find joy again. Eleanor didn't know if Thomas would ever be capable of following his wife's advice. But she was beginning to understand that the Rolling Bee ranch held more complexity than she'd initially imagined, layers of grief and hope, loss and possibility, all tangled together like threads in Catherine's quilts. Outside, snow continued. Falling, soft and relentless, covering everything in white. Tomorrow there would be more work, more routines, more careful navigation of the space between employer and employee. But tonight, Eleanor let herself feel something close to contentment. It wasn't freedom. But perhaps it was enough. December brought bone-deep cold and shorter days. The ranch settled into winter's grip, where each morning meant breaking ice on water troughs and each evening meant huddling close to the fire. Eleanor had been at the Rolling Bee for 2 months now, and the place had begun to feel less like a prison and more like simply where she lived. She'd taken over the garden completely, planning next season's planting with careful attention to crop rotation and companion planting. Jack had helped her build cold frames for winter greens, and she'd successfully grown lettuce and spinach despite the freezing temperatures. Thomas had seemed genuinely impressed, studying her setup with thoughtful interest. "Your mother teach you this?" he'd asked. "Books, mostly." The boarding house had a library, old dusty things nobody read. I learned what I could. The household had fallen into comfortable patterns. Eleanor cooked, Thomas and the hands worked the land and animals, and evenings found them gathering around the fire with coffee and quiet conversation. Pete had a harmonica he played sometimes. Simple tunes that filled the silence. Danny carved small figures from wood scraps, birds, mostly with surprising detail. Christmas approached, and Eleanor found herself thinking about traditions she'd abandoned years ago. Her mother used to make special cookies. Her father would cut a small tree from the woods, and they'd sing carols in their tiny parlor. After her mother died, Christmas had become just another day marked by her father's drinking and debts. She was kneading bread dough when Thomas came in from the morning cold, stamping snow from his boots. He looked uncomfortable, which immediately caught Eleanor's attention. Thomas was never uncomfortable. He was steady as stone, predictable as sunrise. "Need to talk to you," he said, removing his coat with unnecessary care. Eleanor's stomach tightened. Those words never meant anything good. Was he selling her contract? Had she done something wrong? She wiped flour from her hands and waited. Thomas poured himself coffee, still not meeting her eyes. "There's a situation, legal thing." He finally looked at her. "The debt you're working off, it's been paid." Eleanor's world tilted. "What?" "The Caldwell Mining Company sold your father's debt to me when I bought your contract. I paid the full amount last week. You're not indentured anymore." The words didn't make sense. Eleanor sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unreliable. "I don't understand. Why would you pay it off? I'm supposed to work 5 years. Because keeping you here against your will didn't sit right." Thomas set his coffee down, his expression serious. "You're free to go, Eleanor. I'll give you money for travel, help you get wherever you want to go. You don't owe me anything. Freedom." The word should have felt like wings, but instead it felt like vertigo. Eleanor had spent so long being owned, being told where to go and what to do, that the idea of choice seemed impossible to grasp. "Where would I go?" she asked quietly. "Anywhere. You could go east, find work in a city, or west to California. Hell, you could stay in Montana if you wanted. Just somewhere that's your choice." Eleanor looked around the kitchen, her kitchen. In a way, she'd organized it, learned its rhythms, made it efficient and welcoming. Upstairs was her room with the quilt she'd mended, the window overlooking land she'd come to know. In the root cellar were vegetables she'd grown and preserved. Next spring, her garden would bloom. "What if I don't want to leave?" she said. Thomas's expression shifted surprise, then something more complicated. "Then we'd need to discuss terms. I'd hire you proper, with wages. You'd be an employee, not property. You could quit any time. How much would you pay?" $20 a month, plus room and board. That's fair wage for a housekeeper. It was more than fair. It was generous. Eleanor studied Thomas's face, searching for the angle, the hidden cost. Men didn't just free women from debt contracts and offer them paying work. There had to be something more. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Thomas was quiet, his fingers drumming against his coffee mug. "Because you deserve better than being someone's bought labor. Because you work harder than anyone I've ever hired, and you should be compensated properly. And because ... He paused, seeming to wrestle with words. "Because Catherine's letters were right. About not mourning forever." About letting new things happen. Eleanor's heart beat faster. What are you saying? I'm saying you could stay as paid help with a proper arrangement. Or ... He took a breath. Or you could stay as my wife. The world stopped. Eleanor stared at him, certain she'd misheard. Your wife? It's practical, Thomas said quickly, falling back on familiar ground. You already run the house. We work well together. People in town talk regardless. Being married would silence that. And it would give you security, protection, a legal name that isn't tied to your father's debts. Practical, Eleanor repeated, the word tasting strange. You're proposing marriage as a practical arrangement. I'm proposing marriage because it makes sense. Thomas met her eyes. I'm not offering romance or love. I can't. That part of me died with Catherine. But I can offer partnership, respect, a home that's truly yours, not just where you work. Eleanor stood, needing to move, needing space to think. She walked to the window, watching snow fall in the yard. Marriage to Thomas Brennan. Becoming his wife in name, if not in heart. Having the legal protection of his surname, the security of a real home, the freedom that came with being a wife rather than a servant, but also accepting that she'd never have what Catherine had: Thomas's love. His devotion, the kind of marriage where two people fit together like halves of one coin. She'd be a practical solution to practical problems, nothing more. What would this marriage look like? She asked, her back still to him. Separate bedrooms. Your room would stay yours. We'd present as husband and wife publicly, but privately, we'd just be partners running a ranch. You'd have access to household funds, authority over the house and garden, legal say in decisions that affect you. And if I wanted to leave someday, then you'd leave. I wouldn't stop you. Eleanor turned to face him. Thomas stood by the table, his posture tense, his expression guarded. He was taking a risk. She realized, offering her something that could be refused, opening himself to rejection. For a man who'd buried himself in work and grief for 2 years, that took courage. Can I think about it? She asked. Of course. Take all the time you need. He moved toward the door, clearly relieved the conversation was ending. Like I said, you're free regardless. The offer to help you leave still stands if that's what you want. After he left, Eleanor sank back into her chair, her bread dough forgotten. Free. She was free. Could leave tomorrow if she wanted, take Thomas's money, and disappear into a life of her own choosing. The possibility felt enormous and terrifying. But where would she go? She had no family, no friends waiting in distant cities. Her mother was dead, her father dead, her old life scattered to ashes. The skills she had: cooking, cleaning, sewing, gardening would get her work anywhere, but would she find anywhere better than here? The rolling bee ranch had become familiar. The work was hard but satisfying. The people were kind. Thomas was ... Thomas. Steady, honest, damaged, but trying. Not warm, not romantic, but decent in ways that mattered. And there was the garden, her garden. The seeds she'd ordered, the plans she'd made, the vision of spring blooming with vegetables and flowers. Walking away would mean abandoning that. Starting over somewhere else with nothing. Eleanor spent the day in a fog, going through motions while her mind spun. She made dinner: mechanically roasted venison, potatoes, preserved green beans. The men ate and thanked her, seeming to notice. Nothing unusual. Thomas was especially quiet, barely meeting her eyes. That night, Eleanor lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Through the wall, she could hear Thomas moving in his room, pacing from the sound of it. He was nervous, she realized. Waiting for her answer, uncertain which way she'd choose. She thought about Catherine's letters. Don't mourn too long. Find joy again. Love isn't finite. But Catherine had been writing about love, real love, the kind that filled hearts and lives. What Thomas was offering wasn't that. It was structure without passion, partnership without romance. Was that enough? Could Eleanor build a life on practical foundations? accepting that she'd never be truly loved by the man she married. Then again, what was the alternative? Leaving to find what? Another boarding house, another mill, another place where she'd be alone and vulnerable. At least here she had value, purpose, a place that felt almost like home. By morning, Eleanor had made her decision. She dressed carefully in one of her better dresses, braided her hair, and went downstairs to find Thomas already in the kitchen, drinking coffee with the desperate intensity of someone who hadn't slept. "Yes," she said simply. Thomas looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you. On your terms, partnership, separate rooms, practical arrangement, yes." Something like relief flooded his face. He stood, setting down his mug. "You're certain? I'm certain that this is the best option available to me, and that you're a decent man offering me more than I'd find anywhere else." Eleanor met his eyes. "I won't pretend it's a love match, but I think we can make it work." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then we'll go to town tomorrow. Get married at the courthouse. Simple, quick, legal. All right." They stood facing each other across the kitchen, two people agreeing to tie their lives together without love, without passion, with nothing but practical necessity and mutual respect. It should have felt hollow. Instead, Eleanor felt something close to hope. Maybe practical was enough. Maybe partnership could become something more, given time. Or maybe it would stay exactly what it was, two damaged people finding shelter in each other's company. Either way, Eleanor Hastings would become Eleanor Brennan. And for the first time in years, she'd have a name that was hers by choice, not inheritance. Outside, snow continued falling, covering the ranch in white silence. Tomorrow would bring change. But tonight, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine spring her. Garden blooming, the ranch running smooth, and a life that was finally, imperfectly, her own. The courthouse in Caldwell was a stern brick building that smelled of dust and old paper. Eleanor stood beside Thomas in front of Judge Harrison's desk, wearing her best dress, the blue cotton she'd sewn herself, and holding a small bouquet of dried wildflowers Jack had awkwardly pressed into her hands that morning. "Thought you should have something," he'd mumbled, his weathered face flushing. "Even if it ain't a fancy wedding." The ceremony took less than 10 minutes. Judge Harrison, a portly man with spectacles sliding down his nose, read through the legal requirements. In a monotone voice, "Did Thomas take Eleanor as his lawful wife?" He did. Did Eleanor take Thomas as her lawful husband? She did, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "By the power vested in me by the state of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Thomas and Eleanor looked at each other, both frozen with uncertainty. The judge cleared his throat meaningfully. Thomas leaned forward and pressed a brief, awkward kiss to Eleanor's cheek, more like a gesture between distant relatives than newlyweds. "Congratulations," Judge Harrison said, without enthusiasm, handing Thomas the marriage certificate. "That'll be $5. They left the courthouse as Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Brennan, legally bound in a marriage that felt surreal. Eleanor kept glancing at the certificate Thomas tucked into his coat pocket, proof that her name had changed, that she was no longer Thomas Hastings's daughter, but Thomas Brennan's wife. "Need to stop at the bank," Thomas said as they walked toward the wagon. "Put your name on the accounts. You'll need access to household funds." At the bank, Mr. Clifford, the same banker who'd filed debt claims against Eleanor months ago, processed the paperwork with poorly concealed surprise. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, testing the name. "Quite a change from when I last saw you." "Yes," Eleanor replied coolly. "Quite a change." Thomas signed documents adding Eleanor's name to both his personal and ranch accounts. Real money, real authority. Eleanor watched the banker's pen scratch across forms and felt power shift. She was no longer property or debtor, but a woman with legal standing and financial access. Their final stop was the Mercantile. Mrs. Palmer's eyebrows nearly disappeared into her hairline when Thomas introduced Eleanor as his wife. Married, she said, her voice sharp with judgment. That was rather sudden, wasn't it? Quick courtship, Thomas said flatly. We came for supplies and to update Eleanor's account. She'll be making purchases in her own name from now on. Mrs. Palmer's mouth pinched like she'd bitten a lemon, but she nodded. Business was business, even when it came from women she disapproved of. Eleanor ordered fabric for new curtains, seeds for early spring planting, and other household necessities. Signing her new name with careful precision, Eleanor Brennan. Each time she wrote it, the name felt more real. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them processing what they'd done. Eleanor twisted the plain gold band Thomas had purchased that morning, simple, practical, exactly what their marriage was. It felt strange on her finger, a physical reminder of vows taken without love. You all right? Thomas asked as they neared the ranch. Yes. Just adjusting. It's a lot to adjust to. He paused. But nothing really changes at the ranch. You keep doing what you've been doing, just with legal protection now. Legal protection. That's what this was, a shield against a world that saw unmarried women as vulnerable, as property waiting to be claimed. Eleanor understood that and was grateful, even if gratitude felt like an inadequate response to marriage. Jack, Pete, and Danny were waiting at the house when they arrived, having somehow transformed the main room while they'd been gone. Garlands of pine branches draped the mantel, candles clustered on tables, and a modest feast spread across the dining table: roasted chicken, potatoes, bread, even a pie. Figured you should have some kind of celebration, Jack said, looking embarrassed. Even if it's just us. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, the first genuine emotion she'd felt all day. Thank you, Thank you. They ate together, the five of them, with Pete playing cheerful tunes on his harmonica between courses. Danny presented Eleanor with a carved wooden bird, a wren, he explained, because they were small but resilient. The evening felt warm and companionable, almost festive despite its unconventional nature. After the hands returned to the bunkhouse, Eleanor cleaned the kitchen while Thomas banked the fire. The day was ending, and soon they'd retreat to their separate rooms, husband and wife in name only, keeping to the boundaries they'd established. Eleanor, Thomas said from the doorway. I want you to know, I take this seriously. The marriage. I mean, you're not just convenient help with a new title. You're my wife, and that means something. What does it mean? Eleanor asked, genuinely curious. Thomas struggled for words. It means I'll protect you, provide for you, honor the commitment we made, even if it's not traditional. He shifted uncomfortably. And it means I'll try to be a decent husband in whatever way I can. Eleanor set down her dishcloth and crossed to him. On impulse, she took his hand, the first time she'd initiated touch between them. His hand was rough, calloused from ranch work, but warm. I'll try too, she said, to be a decent wife, to make this work. Thomas squeezed her hand briefly, then released it. Get some rest. Tomorrow's still a working day. Eleanor climbed the stairs to her room still, as promised. She undressed and lay in bed, staring at the gold band on her finger. Mrs. Thomas Brennan. Eleanor Brennan. A woman with a home, a name, and a husband who didn't love her, but respected her. It wasn't what she'd dreamed of as a girl. But dreams were for people whose lives hadn't been sold at auction. Winter deepened, January bringing temperatures that made the previous cold seem mild. Eleanor threw herself into managing the household with new authority. She reorganized storage, planned meals weeks in advance, and began teaching herself bookkeeping from Catherine's old ledgers. Thomas noticed. You've got a head for numbers, he said one evening, watching her update accounts. Better than mine. My mother insisted I learn mathematics properly. Said women needed practical skills, not just decorative ones. Your mother was smart. They'd fallen into a companionable routine: meals together, evenings by the fire, conversations that ranged From ranch business to books Eleanor borrowed from Jack's small collection. Thomas gradually opened up, sharing stories about building the ranch, about Catherine's dreams for the place, about his own childhood on a hardscrabble farm in Wyoming. Eleanor shared too, cautiously at first, then with growing ease. She told him about her mother's death, her father's descent into debt and drink, the humiliation of being sold the first time. Thomas listened without judgment, his gray eyes steady and attentive. "You survived a lot," he said quietly. "Most people would have broken. I almost did, several times. But you didn't. That takes strength." The words warmed Eleanor more than she'd expected. Thomas wasn't effusive or romantic, but his respect felt genuine, earned, rather than given automatically. February brought a crisis. One of the ranch hands, a drifter Thomas had hired for seasonal work, got drunk in town and started talking about how Thomas Brennan had bought himself a wife at auction, how the whole marriage was just legal cover for owning a woman. Pete came back furious, telling them what he'd heard. Half the saloon was listening. "People are talking, saying ugly things." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Let them talk." "But it's not true," Eleanor said. "Not anymore. I wasn't bought as a wife, I was freed, then chose to marry you." "Truth doesn't matter much when people prefer the scandal," Jack said darkly. Eleanor made a decision. "Then we tell them the truth, publicly." Thomas looked at her with surprise. "You don't owe anyone explanations. Maybe not. But I'm tired of being talked about like I'm not a real person." Eleanor's voice was firm. "Sunday's church service. Half the town will be there. We go together and face it directly." They hadn't attended church since the wedding. Thomas wasn't particularly religious, and Eleanor had felt too uncertain of her place. But Sunday morning found them dressed in their best clothes, riding into Caldwell with determination replacing nerves. Small white church fell silent when they entered. Every head turned, eyes tracking them as they walked down the aisle to an empty pew. Eleanor kept her chin high, her hand resting on Thomas's arm. They were married, legal and proper, and she refused to act ashamed. Reverend Matthews stumbled through his sermon, clearly distracted by their presence. After the service, people clustered outside in small groups, whispering and staring. Mrs. Palmer stood with a circle of women, her expression triumphant with assumed vindication. Eleanor walked directly to them. "Mrs. Palmer, ladies, I understand. There's been talk about my marriage." The women shifted uncomfortably, caught between curiosity and propriety. Mrs. Palmer recovered first. "Well, Mrs. Brennan, you must admit the circumstances were unusual." "They were," Eleanor agreed calmly. "My father died owing debts I inherited. I was sold to satisfy those debts, a legal practice however unjust. Thomas bought my contract and later paid off the debt entirely, freeing me. He then asked me to marry him, and I accepted. That's the truth." "Rather convenient timing," Mrs. Palmer sniffed. "Convenient for me, certainly. I went from being property to being a free woman with choices. Thomas gave me that freedom before proposing, knowing I might leave. I chose to stay and marry him. That was my choice, made freely." One of the younger women, Sarah Mitchell, spoke up. "Is it true he offered you wages to stay as hired help?" "Yes, $20 a month, which I declined in favor of marriage." Eleanor met each woman's eyes in turn. "I know what you're thinking, that no woman would choose such a marriage unless forced. But you don't know what it's like to have no choices at all. Thomas offered me respect, partnership, and security. That's more than most marriages start with." The women had no response to that. Even Mrs. Palmer looked momentarily uncertain. Thomas appeared at Eleanor's elbow, and together they walked back to the wagon, leaving the church crowd buzzing with renewed gossip, but gossip with less certain moral ground. "That was brave," Thomas said as they drove home. "That was necessary. I won't spend years hiding or being ashamed of choices I'm not ashamed of." Thomas smiled a real smile, rare and transforming. "Catherine would have liked you." The words should have hurt, referencing his dead wife. Instead, Eleanor felt honored. Catherine's ghost had haunted this marriage from the beginning, but maybe that was all right. Maybe loving someone lost didn't prevent respecting someone present. Spring arrived gradually, snowmelt revealing brown earth hungry for warmth. Eleanor's garden became her obsession. She worked the soil, added compost from the barn, marked out beds with string and stakes. The seed catalog she'd ordered arrived, and she spent evenings planning with botanical precision. Thomas helped when he could, following her directions for building raised beds and deer fencing. He'd never cared much for gardening, but he appreciated Eleanor's systematic approach, the way she researched and planned rather than just scattering seeds randomly. You could grow food for half the county with this setup, he observed, watching her plant early peas. That's the idea. If we produce surplus, we can sell it in town. Extra income for the ranch. Thomas looked at her thoughtfully. When did you start thinking of it as our ranch? Eleanor paused, surprised by the question. When had she? Somewhere between winter and spring, between being owned and being married. The ranch had stopped being Thomas's place where she worked and become simply home. I don't know, she admitted, but it happened. By April, green shoots pushed through the soil: peas, lettuce, radishes, herbs. Eleanor checked them obsessively, thrilled by each sign of growth. The garden represented possibility, proof that careful work yielded results, that destruction could be reversed by patient cultivation. One warm evening, Thomas found her sitting among the beds, just watching things grow. He sat beside her without speaking, both of them comfortable in silence. I've been thinking, Thomas said finally, about what Catherine wrote in those letters. About not mourning forever. Eleanor's heart beat faster, but she kept her voice steady. And I think I've been mourning wrong. Thinking that moving forward meant forgetting, or replacing what I lost. He picked up a handful of soil, letting it sift through his fingers. But maybe it means making room for new things. Different things. Like practical marriages? Eleanor said lightly, trying to ease the tension. Like marriages that start practical and become ... something else. Eleanor looked at him, this man who'd bought her freedom and offered his name without demanding anything in return. What kind of something else? I don't know yet, but I'd like to find out. If you would. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't poetry or passion. But it was honest, and it was more than nothing they'd started with. I'd like that, Eleanor said quietly. Thomas reached over and took her hand, not awkwardly, not uncertainly, but with deliberate intention. They sat together in the growing dusk, surrounded by new growth. Two damaged people learning to be whole. Summer brought abundance. Eleanor's garden exploded with vegetables, tomatoes, beans, squash, peppers, carrots. She preserved everything she could, filling the root cellar with jars of pickles, relishes, and sauces. The surplus went to town, where Mr. Chun sold it in his store, splitting profits with Eleanor. You've got a real business here, he told her, counting out money. Best produce in the county. The ranch prospered. Cattle brought good prices, the hands worked efficiently, and the household ran smooth as clockwork. Jack told Eleanor she brought life back to the place, and she believed him. The rolling bee felt alive again, not the same as when Catherine lived, but vital in new ways. Thomas changed too, slowly but noticeably. He smiled more, talked more, occasionally laughed at Pete's jokes. He started joining Eleanor in the garden. Sometimes, not to work, but just to sit and talk while she weeded. They discussed everything: politics, books, childhood memories, dreams for expanding the ranch. One August night, after a particularly successful cattle sale, Thomas knocked on Eleanor's bedroom door. She opened it, surprised they'd maintained the separate bedrooms rule religiously. Can we talk? He asked. Of course. They went to the porch, sitting on the steps under a sky brilliant with stars. Thomas seemed nervous, unusual for him. I've been thinking about our arrangement, he said. The separate bedrooms, the partnership without intimacy. Eleanor's pulse quickened. Yes? I want to change it. Not force anything, just ask if you'd be willing to try being married in all the ways. Sharing a room, being together properly. He looked at her intently. I know I said I couldn't love again, but I was wrong. I do love you, Eleanor. Not the same way I loved Catherine, but that's all right. It's different, but it's real. Eleanor felt tears blur her vision. She'd hoped for this, but hadn't dared expect it. You love me? Yes, you're brave, capable, funny when you let yourself be. You've made this house a home again, made me want to live instead of just surviving. He took her hand. I know I'm not easy. I'm quiet and stubborn and probably always will be. But if you're willing, I'd like to try being your husband in more than name. Eleanor didn't need to think. She'd been falling in love with Thomas Brennan for months without admitting it, loving his steadiness, his integrity, the way he'd given her freedom and then hoped she'd choose to stay. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'm willing. I love you too. Thomas pulled her close, and they kissed, not awkward this time, but sure and sweet. When they pulled apart, both were crying and laughing simultaneously. So Mrs. Brennan, Thomas said, wiping tears from her cheeks, think you can tolerate sharing a room with your practical husband? I think I can manage, Eleanor replied, smiling through tears. That night, Eleanor moved her things to Thomas's room, their room now. They lay together talking until dawn, making up for months of careful distance. It wasn't perfect or magical, but it was real. Two people who'd found each other through circumstance and chosen to build something lasting. Eleanor woke on a crisp October morning, 1 year after Thomas had bought her contract at the auction house. She lay in bed beside her sleeping husband, watching sunlight paint patterns on the ceiling. Outside, her garden was finishing its season, producing late tomatoes and autumn squash. She thought about that desperate woman on the auction platform, convinced her life would never be her own. She'd been wrong. Life had a way of surprising you, offering hope when you'd stopped expecting it, giving you home when you'd resigned yourself to drifting. Thomas stirred beside her, his arm tightening around her waist. Morning, he murmured sleepily. Morning. What are you thinking about? How far we've come. How different everything is. Thomas propped himself up, looking at her with those gray eyes that had become beloved. Any regrets? Eleanor considered. She'd been sold to pay debts she hadn't earned. Bought by a grieving widower, married in a practical arrangement without love. By any conventional measure, her story should be tragic, but she'd also been freed, given choices, offered respect and partnership. She'd built a garden from nothing, helped run a successful ranch, earned a place in a community. She'd fallen in love and been loved in return. The journey had been hard, but the destination was worth it. No regrets, she said firmly. Not one. Thomas kissed her forehead. Good, because I'm keeping you, Eleanor Brennan. You're stuck with me now. I can live with that. They rose and dressed, beginning another day on the Rolling Bee Ranch. There was work to do, always work, endless and satisfying. But now it was work Eleanor chose, in a home she'd helped build, beside a man she loved. The autumn sun climbed higher, burning off morning mist. Eleanor stood at the window, looking out at the land she'd learned to call home. Somewhere in Caldwell, another auction might be happening. Another desperate person being sold to satisfy debts not their own. Eleanor couldn't save them all. But she'd saved herself, with Thomas's help, yes, but ultimately through her own strength and choices. She'd taken a practical arrangement and transformed it into something precious. She'd taken the name of a man who'd bought her freedom and made it truly her own. Eleanor Hastings had been a debt collector's daughter, sold and resold, never quite belonging anywhere. Eleanor Brennan was a rancher's wife, a gardener, a woman with a home and a future. She belonged to herself now, and that made all the difference. Thomas came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. Penny for your thoughts? Eleanor leaned back against him, solid and steady, and hers. Just thinking I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. So am I, Thomas said quietly. So am I. Outside, the Montana wind whispered through the grass, carrying the promise of winter and the certainty of spring beyond. The Rolling Bee Ranch stood solid against the sky. Shelter and home, and proof that even broken things could be rebuilt into something beautiful. And inside, Eleanor Brennan smiled, free at last. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.